And we are now live on Facebook. So everyone can just pull through and then they can watch us on Facebook and then they can engage with us via Facebook. We do apologize for being 5 minutes late. We're just having problems with connecting to the internet. But anyhow, tonight we have Comrade Carl, who will be speaking about the significance and the importance of the tripartite alliance in a democratic state. This year, the country celebrates the 55th anniversary of the drafting of the Freedom Charter in Kliptown, of which I think we all know that the drafting of the Freedom Charter laid a solid foundation for what would be the alliance in 1990. Of course, the alliance traced back way before the 1990, and its existence can be traced back to the 1950s. And we think it's very important that we have a discussion about the alliance and we discuss the importance of the alliance and how we keep guard of the alliance, especially in a democratic state whereby we're seeing some alliance partners wanting to break away from the alliance and contest elections independently, be it local, provincial, or even national government. The late Chief of Staff of the MK and also the former Secretary General of the SACP, Comrade Chris Tembisileane, once stressed of the importance of the alliance and how we need to keep guard of the alliance, stating that it is the alliance that has built and made the party what it is. The alliance is undeniably a strong force and was a strong force against the apartheid racist regime. And tonight we'll be speaking about the importance of guarding it and how that alliance is still relevant even today. We have with us who will give the lecture, Comrade Carl. Comrade Carl needs no introduction. Comrade Carl is a veteran of our movement. He's a former NEC member. Currently, he's serving as a member, an NEC member of the MKMVA, and he's a spokesperson of the MKMVA. Comrade Carl, without any waste of time, I will hand over to you.
Thank you, Comrade Nantu, and thank you for facilitating this live Facebook lecture for branch in Ward 115. I have a strong affiliation with the Dalla Oma region. And I remember that not so long ago, I visited the region together with our Secretary General, Comrade Ace Magashule. One of my very close political associates and whom I also consider a friend is Comrade Khalid Sayed, who is also from the Dalla Oma region. Comrades, I think it is critically important that we discuss the role of the alliance, or as it is also called, the tripartite alliance, in the current political context. We must remember that when we look at the whole history of the African National Congress since 1912, that underlying the ANC's existence and political modus operandi has always been broad-based alliance politics. So when we talk about alliance politics in the African National Congress context, we do not start talking about the last few decades. Indeed, we speak about the whole 108 years of the existence of the African National Congress. If we consider the speech that Pixleke Isaka Seme made at the launch of the African National Congress, at the birth of the African National Congress in the Waiuk Methodist Church in Mangaung on the 8th of January 1912, we get the sense of building a broad base of unity, but also unity in diversity. That is why I put on tonight my very special T-shirt that I've been given by a very close friend, and which has on the one side unity in diversity. because that is the fundamental underlying process that we look at. Now, comrades, the alliance itself was officially formed in 1990, and it came from 3 different parties: the African National Congress, COSATU, which emerged from the former SACTU, and the South African Communist Party. But when we look at the formation of the alliance, we have to first and foremost go to the history of the African National Congress and the formation of alliance politics, as I said, which already started in 1912, but which got a very special expression. And also, I would believe, a radicalization of the African National Congress as liberation movement through the Free Doctors Pact of 1947. The 3 doctors were Dr. A.B. Kuma, Dr. Monty Naike from the Natal Indian Congress, and Dr. Joseph Dadoo. This pact was joined later, a number of years later, by the Congress of Democrats, which made up white Democrats who were far more progressive and radical in their outlook than, for instance, the old United Party or the old Federal Party, which later on became the Progressive Federal Party. This alliance, this broad base, which was formed from 1947 onwards, was critical for eventually the Congress of Democrats, the Indian Congress, the South African Indian Congress, the ANC, all of them coming together at the Congress of the People at Kliptown. And as Comrade Nantu already indicated, it was exactly in the Congress of the People where the Freedom Charter that was drafted by this broad alliance came about. And the Freedom Charter provided for us in the African National Congress that critically important direction-giving document, which stated clearly what the African National Congress and its alliance partners stands for, and stated very clearly what the aims are for empowering the people of South Africa. I'm not this evening going to state the 10 different clauses of the Freedom Charter as it is set out, but I want to encapsulate the essence of the Freedom Charter in the words that the people shall govern, that the land shall be shared amongst those who work it, and that the wealth of the country shall be shared and all the people of South Africa shall benefit from it. This expression was to a large extent also based on the interaction between the African National Congress, South African Congress of Trade Unions, and very importantly, the South African Communist Party. Because it is quite correct to say that the role of the South African Communist Party throughout has been to play a critical, foundational position for the ideological development of the African National Congress, slowly from a broad-based nationalist movement to a more radical, to a more socio-economically conscious and moving towards socialist movement. So the role of the SACP in the context of the drafting of the Freedom Charter is critically important. Let me then start with the SACP as the oldest communist party in South Africa, which was formed in 1921. And it is only one of the 20 parties that survived the anti-communist purge post-independence in many African countries. Its membership went through cycles over the years. And in terms of membership, the SACP can be considered to be the smallest of the three alliance partners, but critically important, as I said, for the ideological development of the African National Congress over a long period of time. It is also still officially a Marxist-Leninist party, while many of the other former communist parties have transformed or changed themselves into what is today more called socialist or social democratic parties. In 1993, after the formal formation of the alliance or the tripartite alliance, the South African National Civic Organization, SANCO, was also co-opted into this alliance. It was an important co-option because of the importance of local government and us making sure that the alliance and its work can be done also at the local government level. However, I think it would not be wrong to say that of the various members of the alliance, SANCO is probably the one that is playing the least significant role at this stage within the alliance. It doesn't need to stay like that, but that is the reality at the moment. So this alliance that has been formed consists of separate but very intertwined organizations. And as this alliance had been formed over a long period of time, before it was officially announced and formed in 1990, we can consider how alliance politics had influenced not only what happened at the Congress of the People in Kliptown in 1956, but also the significant role that the alliance played in the radicalization of the African National Congress's opposition to apartheid, with specific reference to the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe in 1961. Umkhonto we Sizwe came about because of the interactions also between the South African Communist Party, the African National Congress, and the Congress of Democrats. And in the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, the SACP, both at an ideological level, but also with regards to material provision for the conducting process of an armed struggle, and also its links that it was able to provide to the Soviet Union and other countries in the East Bloc of Europe, was critical for not only the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe, but in subsequent years, especially after the African National Congress, the SACP, and the rest of the liberation movements were banned, for Umkhonto we Sizwe to be able to be sustained within the context of the armed struggle because of that support base, which to a very large extent originated also from the role of the South African Communist Party. I want to read a quote by Comrade Joe Slovo, which was published in 1987 in the World Marxist Review, Volume 30, number 6. It read as follows. To be true, and he's talking here about the alliance, but take note, he's already talking about this alliance because it is in the context of the alliance politics quite a number of years before the alliance formally came about in 1990. Comrade Joe Slovo is speaking here in June 1987. I open quote. To be true to history, we must concede that there have been difficulties as well as triumphs along our path. As traversing many decades, our organizations have converged towards a shared strategy of struggle. Ours is not merely a paper alliance, created at conference tables and formalized through the signing of documents and representing only an agreement of leaders. Our alliance is a living organism that has grown out of struggle. Within our revolutionary alliance, each organization has a distinct and vital role to play. A correct understanding of these roles and respect for their boundaries has ensured the survival and consolidation of our cooperation and unity. Interestingly enough, this process of bringing the alliance together and also understanding the distinct and vitally different roles that the members of the alliance have to play, to a large extent happened within the physical space of Lakani Chambers in 2 Saville Street in Durban, where these organizations had their meetings, were considering how to pull the alliance together, and ultimately brought it about, as I've already said, in 1990. For purposes of this lecture, I now want to concentrate specifically on the important and distinct and vital roles of the various members of the alliance. As we know, the African National Congress, as the preeminent African national movement in South Africa, plays the leading role in the alliance. It forms the broad base. It pulls together also the other alliance partners. And there ought not and should never be a challenge to the leadership role of the African National Congress within this alliance. The moment that happens, the alliance itself will enter into crisis. The moment we are able to continue to agree that the African National Congress is the leader of the alliance and must provide the broad base for this alliance to move forward, there is a solid foundation. At the same time, while the African National Congress provides that foundation and also is the party in our democracy that has been established since the 27th of April 1994, that contests elections, the role of the other parties in the alliance is critical. Not in the sense of standing as separate structures or organizations in fighting elections, because that is not the case, but in participating as part of the African National Congress's democratic effort for each of these elections. In that sense, both the South African Communist Party and also the Congress of South African Trade Unions, together with the South African National Civic Organization, provides candidates that become part of the ANC's candidate list for those elections. They provide critically important candidates who in many instances provide also the essence of some of the leading candidates and leaders within that election campaign. We've seen that happening over all the years since 1994. Further, it is critically important for us to understand that this process of working together should not undermine the distinct roles that the various organizations have to play. COSATU is first and foremost a trade union movement, representative of the working class and representing the interests of workers within this alliance. In that context, COSATU has to always make sure that the interests of the workers are put foremost within the alliance through its efforts, through its mobilization of the working class, and through the numbers that it brings as a mass-based, multi-union working class organization. The role of the South African Communist Party is one where it has to liaise very closely with the Congress of South African Trade Unions. It is the role of a party that is committed to the vanguard of the workers. It is the role of a party that is committed to make sure that the working class will prevail in the country. It is not a mass-based organization. It is an organization which, in terms of its numbers of those who are members of the South African Communist Party, if it had to participate in elections on its own, would probably not be very significant. But in its role as an alliance partner, where its membership play the role of the historical ideological think tank within the alliance, it has an influence which is much bigger, much more significant than the rather small number of its membership. Together, the South African Communist Party and COSATU ought to make sure the alliance, and specifically the African National Congress as the leader of the alliance, as the party that fights the political elections in our democracy, is in an ideological sense working class orientated with a pro-poor agenda. That I want to emphasize. The role of the SACP, preeminently together with the Congress of South African Trade Unions, ought to be ensuring that the ideology of the African National Congress is pro-working class with a pro-poor agenda within the whole alliance. In this sense, the role of organized labor is critical. The role of organized labor, as it came about with a strong footprint primarily from the early 1980s. And that role can never be underestimated. Now, let us look at where the alliance finds itself at this stage in our history. And Comrade Nantu, I want to, for a moment, pause here, and then I will summarize what I think the essential elements of this tripartite alliance, including also, of course, the fourth party, which is the South African National Civics Organization, should be. Must continue to be what alliance politics had always been within the African National Congress, and that is to build a broad base. But the alliance cannot be a broad base without an ideological soul. And the ideological soul of the alliance always throughout has to be one where it is concerned about the well-being of the majority of Black, especially African poor, and where it has to be concerned about the empowerment of this majority of Black African poor in the context of how South Africa has transformed itself over the decades since the African National Congress was formed in 1912. This process has been one of progressive radicalization, and a progressive commitment to a working class and pro-poor agenda. The question that we have to ask ourselves is whether this broad-based alliance with that ideological heart of being working class and pro-poor continues to be what the alliance is today. I would say that we have gone through difficult times in the last couple of years. Also in the sense that the members of the alliance have allowed themselves sometimes to be derailed from the understanding that the leader of the alliance under all circumstances has to be the African National Congress. There have been unfortunate incidents in the period also before 2017, before the last National Conference of the African National Congress, the 54th National Conference, where some of the alliance members started to position itself as if it wanted to take the lead, if it wanted to take over the alliance. Unfortunate incidences where the leadership role of the African National Congress and its president were not recognized. We know them, and I don't think we need to belabor them at this stage, except to refer to the fact that there were times that the president of the ANC was booed at certain meetings of member unions of the Congress of South African Trade Unions, that there were certain statements by the South African Communist Party which could be construed as challenging the leadership of the ANC and not recognizing the unique and important leadership position of the president of the African National Congress. Those issues in future will have to be addressed very carefully, because it cannot be that the leadership position of the African National Congress in this alliance is challenged. At the same time, it is of critical importance for the South African Communist Party and for the Congress of South African Trade Unions to make sure that on the agenda of the alliance remains the empowerment and the full liberation of the working class. My concern at this stage in the history of South Africa is that that does not necessarily always happen. There had been lapses in serving that critically ideological foundation and purpose that these parties of the alliance should play. And in the process of those lapses, we have seen unfortunate situations where the South African Communist Party specifically, but even some of the members of the Congress of South African Trade Unions have associated themselves with what I would call reactionary forces in South Africa. We refer specifically to some of the events that took place in 2015 and 2016, where the SACP and some of the member unions of the Congress of South African Trade Unions made common cause with the reactionary and conservative forces such as the Save South Africa campaign, and also allowed itself to be used as an attack tool on the leadership of the African National Congress. This, I would say, is the ideological depth of crisis in the alliance that had been reached during that period. And it certainly damaged the alliance. It also led to a situation in 2016 where there was the aberration that in a number of local government by-elections, the South African Communist Party decided to launch its own candidates and fight those elections independently from the alliance. That was entirely wrong. And it challenged the unity of the alliance in a way that we should try and avoid at all cost in the future. Now, what is the challenges that we are faced with now? The African National Congress, as I've indicated, will and was and will continue in the future to be a broad-based, broad church. Its ideological position will reflect that diversity of the broad base or broad church that it makes out to be. The challenge is, how does the alliance play the role that it has played even before 1990, when we had the alliance of the Congress of Democrats, South African Communist Party, SACTU, and in a sense, those that were deeply concerned about a pro-poor agenda in South Africa. How can that role continue to be played in the history of South Africa right now? That role will have to be played in an understanding of how the alliance influenced what happened at the 54th National Conference of the African National Congress. And I'm not talking here specifically about the election of the leadership of the ANC. I'm talking more about the underlying ideological underpinnings of what happened in the various committees, discussion groups, the various subcommittees that there were at the 54th National Conference, and the resolutions that resulted from those discussions. Resolutions that were broad-based, democratic, representative from the various representatives of the branches of the African National Congress that were at that conference, but obviously also strongly influenced by the presence of the alliance partners, all of them, COSATU, South African Communist Party, and also the South African National Civics Association organization. The result was a set of political, economical decisions, which in a broad sense can be described as radical economic transformation resolutions. Those resolutions included, and I don't need to repeat all of them because I think we know them, those of us who were at the conference, participated in the intense debates during that conference, will know very well what I'm talking about. The expropriation of land without compensation. The transformation of our financial institutions so that they will truly be at the service of the majority of our people, and especially the empowerment of emerging Black entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized businesses. The nationalization of the South African Reserve Bank. I just mentioned a few of those resolutions. These are resolutions that should fall squarely within the historical ideological role that the South African Communist Party and also the trade union movement through COSATU should play and should support. The fact that halfway through the term of office of our current elected leadership within the African National Congress, that those resolutions are not yet to any significant extent implemented inside the African National Congress in terms of making sure that those resolutions find its way through the structures and into our democratic government, of which the ANC is the leader, is a question of concern. It is something which the alliance should address seriously. And it is something that the Alliance should address in the context of the role that the Alliance had always played in the history of our liberation struggle. Namely, to make sure that the broad base, broad church structure of the African National Congress does not lose an ideological foundation. The Alliance should provide that ideological foundation. Now, let me pause here for a moment, Comrade Nantu. When we talk like this, when we address the basic character of the African National Congress as a broad-based, broad church, and we then talk about the need for an ideological foundation, a political, ideological foundation and heart. We are not talking about creating pockets of certain ideologies and certain positions which should play itself off vis-a-vis the other. We are not talking about creating groupings which must stand separate from the broad alliance and from this broad church character of the African National Congress. We should never do that. We should understand the very important message that Comrade Joe Slovo provided to us in that quote that I've read out earlier. When he said, our alliance is a living organism that has grown out of the struggle. There are particular revolutionary and distinct roles that must be played by the various alliance partners. And a correct understanding of those roles and a respect for the boundaries has ensured the survival, consolidation, and cooperation and unity of our movement. You see, comrades, we can so easily, when we talk about the need for an ideological heart in the African National Congress, isolate that concept and turn it into something that becomes faction. We can so easily, if we do not handle this process very, very carefully, start talking about the need for radical economic transformation as if it is something faction. The last couple of weeks, I and many others have again wrestled with the whole issue of what should be the ideological heart of the African National Congress. And at the end of it all, we could only come to one conclusion. The ANC, as a broad-based people's organization, has to continue to be a pro-poor movement. The role of the South African Communist Party within that movement and within this alliance is to be the ideological think tank, and an ideological think tank that must always be there as the vanguard of the proletariat. Therefore, as a pro-poor and working class organization. The South African Congress of Trade Unions has to mobilize the workers along the lines of that pro-poor agenda. And the broad base of the African National Congress has to form the umbrella under which all of this happens. When we understand this, comrades, we can avoid having factional battles, groupings, standoffs within the ANC. As I stand here tonight, the commitment that I and many other ordinary members of the African National Congress have is to see this wonderful movement of ours which started its history as a broad alliance, which understood that it had to be a broad church, which had been slowly but surely infused with a pro-working class and pro-poor agenda, and was radicalized in that process, which in 1947 gave expression to it through the Three Doctors Pact, which in 1948 through the formation of the African National Congress Youth League saw a further radicalization of the African National Congress in general, in the way that the leaders of the Youth League, Anton Lembede, Comrade Oliver Tambo, Nelson Mandela, Walter Sisulu, all of them played their role to make the ANC a more effective and more peoples-orientated organization. How that process played itself out in becoming an effective and radical opposition to apartheid, and also in the formation of Umkhonto we Sizwe on the 16th of December 1961, with a very critical role played, together with the leadership of the African National Congress, by the South African Communist Party and the Congress of Democrats. It was this process, comrades, that transformed the African National Congress from an African national movement, which in its original existence only had a membership of Africans, to a period and many different transitions, to the point where eventually also the ANC became a party that allowed all the various nationalities in South Africa to join. That process, comrades, didn't start only in exile. It wasn't concluded through the Morogoro Conference and the Kapwe conferences. It started already, as I've said, there in 1947 with the Three Doctors Pact. That process has to continue itself today. The ANC stands at a very important juncture, which I would call a crossroads in its history. It can move forward today in a non-ideological fashion. It can lose the radicalization and the intensification of its association with the working class and its pro-poor position if the South African Communist Party and COSATU does not execute the roles that they ought to play. There have been times in the recent history of this alliance where the SACP and COSATU has been found wanting. I'm glad to see that slowly but surely there is a resurgence of the understanding of the role of COSATU within this alliance as bringing the working class forward. It is not going to be easy because COSATU itself is faced with serious challenges because of breakaway unions. COSATU itself has to reassert its identity as a radical representative of the true interests of the working class. Together with COSATU, the South African Communist Party has to re-find its heart as a representative of the working class and indeed as the vanguard of the proletariat. I went to the funeral of one of our great comrades who's been a member of the South African Communist Party and also a member of Umkhonto we Sizwe in Lamontville 2 years ago. And at that funeral, our former President Jacob Zuma, addressed us about the need for the party to play this radical role. I want to re-emphasize it. I want to conclude, comrades, with saying the following. The alliance has to be broad-based. The alliance, and now I'm spelling out principles, has to represent an understanding that the leadership of this broad alliance always has to be in the hands of the African National Congress. The alliance has to work for unity, but the unity it has to infuse must reflect the historical development of the African National Congress and the whole liberation movement since 1912, in the manner in which it had become radicalized, become working class orientated, and developed a pro-poor agenda. If we fail to do that, if we fail to maintain this ideological heart of the African National Congress and of our liberation movement as also expressed in the alliance, if we fail to do that, the African National Congress can lose its role, its position as the leader of society. That is a fate too ghastly to contemplate. That will be a fundamental disaster for the future of our country. And it will be finally the betrayal of the great ideal of the liberation of the majority of Black and especially African South Africans, not only from the shackles of racism, not only from the manner in which democracy had been kept away from us, but the full liberation of our people, which must include, as the second phase of the national democratic revolution, the economic liberation of all South Africans, so that they can control this economy of ours, can wrestle it out of the strangle grip that white monopoly capitalism still has, and can indeed bring all the African and Black South Africans to the position where they can scale the commanding heights of our economy. This should be the mainstream political ideology of the African National Congress and of the Alliance. This should never be sidelined. It should never be categorized as a separate grouping or a faction. It must be mainstreamed. The liberation of our people in the fullest context, also the economic liberation of our people, has to be the ultimate consequence of how the alliance politics of the African National Congress has played itself out throughout all the decades, more than 100 years of existence of the ANC. It was that dream, that hope, that commitment that Comrade O.R. Tambo expressed when he said so clearly at the Kapwe conference that liberation in South Africa will never just be the gaining of the vote, but ultimately it must be the economic liberation of our people. Only the alliance, in the way that it has formed itself through its historical roots, can help to keep us on this road. And that is why, comrades, the tripartite alliance, or the alliance, has to be maintained. And its ultimate aim must be principled revolutionary unity for the empowerment of all the people of South Africa and the liberation of all South Africans, especially Black and specifically African, from the consequences of colonialism, and new colonialism as it had morphed into the control of our economy by white monopoly capitalism. If we understand that process, we will ultimately also be able to address the vexed question of state capture. Because state capture has been, and it is still today, finally the capture of the state in order to control the economy by those white colonialists who morphed their colonial involvement in South Africa to colonialism of a special type and brought us to this point where white monopoly capitalism continue to oppress and control the lives of our people. So ultimately, principled unity informed by political ideology that is working class orientated and pro-poor, underpinned by the broad base of mass support as provided by the South African Congress of Trade Unions and the African National Congress as a mass-based African national movement, can, brought together in all its components, be the true liberator of our people. We've made progress. We haven't yet achieved our goal. We have to stay the course. And part of that process of staying the course has to be to keep the alliance alive, to continue to build unity, to remain principled in our ideology, and to remain true servants of our people. Comrade Nantu, with that, I conclude this lecture, and I'm looking forward now to an engagement with the members of Branch 115, and I believe many others who have participated in this lecture, so that we can have a discussion and engage with each other. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Carl. And I must agree with you that, you know, the main important thing in the alliance would be for each alliance partner to know its role in the alliance. And I think in doing so, it's when we'll be able to have the unity that you spoke of in the alliance and how we move forward into becoming a stronger alliance party than what we are currently. But we have a couple of questions. We've got two from Facebook so far, and then I think there's another one that's coming in. So the first one is, I think it's more of a comment. It's a comment when you were speaking of the period within the alliance where, you know, we had a president that was booed and all that was happening within conferences. And this comment is saying, I think the reason why it happens is because of our people lack good fundamentals, political and ideological education, and are vulnerable to being confused. So that was the comment. And then there is a question after that follows that says, I would like to ask on the adoption of the strategies and tactics of our organization in 1969 in the Morogoro Conference and their full implementation, and why such is still difficult given the time frame. And if we are forever to be taking resolutions without materializing them, then why do we do so? And then the other question would be, I'll just give you the two last questions and then perhaps maybe you can be able to answer them. And then the other one, it's basically a comment that says, I feel the alliance as it opens the movement to infiltrate from counter-revolutionary forces. That was a comment. And then the last question would be your thoughts, Comrade Carl, on the calls to reconfigure the alliance. So for now, that will be the questions we have. I've got 1, 2, 3, 4 other questions as well that I also have received. So I'll just give you time firstly to just respond to the specific ones.
Okay. Look, I think it is important that I start with the last question, because the last question will help us to reflect also on some of the other questions. And that is the alliance opening us up to counter-revolutionary forces? I would be careful to say that. In fact, what I would say is the alliance functioning in its proper way. And Comrade Nanto, as you correctly said, I emphasize the issue of the specific roles that the various parties in the alliance has to play. If those roles are played out properly, the alliance can be an important antidote, counter to counter-revolutionaries. Because the South African Communist Party can play a very important role as the ideological think tank that take us back always to the basic roots of what should be the role of our organization within the context of the vanguard of the poor and of the working class. Also, if the South African Congress of Trade Unions can continue to play its role as a broad-based workers' organization, which doesn't just only mobilize workers, but also feed back into the alliance the responses, the needs, the experiences of the working class, it can help to counter some of the counter-revolutionary tendencies that there may be within our liberation movement. I always say every revolution will generate a counter-revolution. So we should not be surprised by the emergence of counter-revolutionaries. And the very nature of the African National Congress as a broad-based church, which I've repeated several times in this lecture, opens itself up to find within its ranks counter-revolutionaries. That is a reality. But it's not a reality that should scare us away from continuing to maintain this broad base. As long as we can continue to maintain ideological clarity about where our struggle should go. So instead of the alliance becoming a possible vehicle or opening up for counter-revolutionaries, it can also be a very important and critical antidote to counter-revolutionary actions. But then the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions will have to play their vital role. That critical, distinct role, which Comrade Joe Slovo referred to. I think the comrade who in the first question or comment that you referred to the problem that our people do not always have a strong ideological foundation is correct. And I think part of the problem that we were faced with in that period where there were attacks on the president of the African National Congress, where there was disjunction. And I do not want to concentrate specifically on the individual of President Zuma. But I want to refer to the fact that I think there was a situation where, because of a lack of ideological foundational understanding, comrades allowed themselves to be hooked onto campaigns, so to speak, pulled along by campaigns of which they didn't understand what the underlying objective was. And that is why, not in order to cause unhappiness or disunity, or to unnecessarily come and dig up old cows from the graves, I referred to the issue of Save South Africa campaign. Because the Save South Africa campaign, in its essence, was a reactionary, counter-revolutionary operation, funded by organizations internationally that had only one intention, and that is to steer the liberation movement in South Africa away from its pro-working class and pro-poor agenda. That was the ultimate objective. The issue around a particular individual or an individual leader was coincidental. Now, because there is sometimes a failure of understanding of ideology and this ideological foundation, comrades then, sometimes very well-meaning comrades, get hooked onto a caravan which is taking them into a counter-revolutionary direction. Now, obviously, the resolutions that were taken in 1969 around strategy and tactics are very important. And we very often still fail to implement those positions. I think the failure in doing so relate to the same problem that I've just referred to, a lack of ideological clarity. At the same time, the failure to implement overall conference resolutions. Because the problem is not just, we complain at the moment that the official economic policy program of the African National Congress, which is radical economic transformation, in the way in which resolutions had been taken at the 54th National Conference, are not properly implemented. The problem is not just that resolutions of the 54th National Conference had not been implemented. We can go back to Mangaung, we can go back to Stellenbosch, we can go back to the first conference that we had in Durban in 1991, we can go back to conferences of the ANC when it was still in exile. And there are many resolutions that have not been implemented. I ask myself why. It can't just be because of lack of capacity. It must also be because there are counter-revolutionary forces that are working within our movement that tries to prevent us from getting these resolutions implemented. A point in time is where we find ourselves now, where there's evidently counter-revolutionary forces at work that does not want us to implement the resolutions that had been taken, all the resolutions that had been taken at the 54th National Conference. So the challenge for us, comrades, is to get our ideology right. Because if we're ideologically sound, and if we return to what I so often call the heart, the revolutionary heart of the African National Congress, which must be working class orientated, pro-poor as expressed in the Freedom Charter. The consequence, the result, the product of ANC alliance politics, we will be able to resist these counter-revolutionary forces. And that process in itself will become the biggest motor, the biggest engine for unity. Unity can only be based on principle. And principle can only be informed by political ideology. I think I've answered the questions, comrade.
Thanks, Comrade Carl, on that. The last couple of questions we have, so I'll give them to in one go, so because they're actually about 3 or 4 comments, they're not a lot. So the first one is, how do we bring back, so the first one is, how do we bring back respect into the alliance? And then the second one is it because we've changed into power that the alliance is not as strong as it was before? And then the last one is basically a comment where someone is saying, thank you for your commitment to the struggle. So mainly we've got 2 questions, which is the bringing back the respect into the alliance, and also is it because we've changed into power that the alliance is not as strong as it was before?
Let me start with the second question on because we moved into power. You will recall, comrade, that very, very well-known quote by Comrade O.R. Tambo, when he said, comrades, you will realize how difficult the challenge will be when we're in government. And you will find out that that challenge is much more difficult than this liberation struggle that we are conducting now from exile and inside the country. And Comrade O.R. was spot on. Because the moment you move into a position of power, with it comes also a whole set of different challenges and pitfalls. And one of the biggest pitfalls that come with power is the way in which access to resources and money can undermine ideological commitment. Marx said, a person's conscience is determined by his material or her material condition. Very important quote. One that I repeat over and over when I engage with people about this challenge. A person's material conditions determines his or her conscience, or political or ideological conscience. And we've seen that in the context of many of our comrades. We're in the process of having been able to materially improve their lives and their conditions, have become tempted to align themselves with the existing political and economic power in the country, which is underpinned by white monopoly capitalism. So unfortunately, you find yourself in a situation where there are those who have allowed themselves to become the instruments of WMC because their material conditions have changed, because they live now in better situation, because there's financial challenges that they have to address in terms of lifestyle, demands from family, etc., etc. And as a consequence, they lose their ideology. I think what Comrade O.R. was trying to tell us was that the only way in which you're going to be able to face the challenges of governance and being in power is if you have an ideological foundation. If you are driven by the amount of money that is in your bank account and how well lined your pockets are, you're going to sell out your people. If you are driven by ideology, which is historically grounded in this whole lecture that I've given, by how the alliance formed the ANC to become a more radical, pro-poor and working class organization, you will not lose the compass that must keep you on the road. So yes, power has corrupted. But we must not allow power to corrupt us totally. We must challenge that corruption of power through ideology. And we must challenge that corruption of power through mass-based support of the people of this country for the ideology of full economic liberation. That is what we have to do. That is what is possible if we're going to implement the mainstream economic policy program of the ANC, which is radical economic transformation. Now, that answer that I've given you connects with the issue of respect. You see, comrades, we can talk a lot about you must respect the senior leadership. You must respect this particular person. But that's not the ultimate challenge of respect. The ultimate challenge of respect is to respect the people. If you lose your respect for the people, if you fail to understand that the ANC is only the leader of society because it is built on the foundation of grassroots members and branches, if you fail to take that building blocks of the African National Congress seriously, if you start thinking of the people as instruments which must only serve you rather than you being the servant of the people, then respect is gone. And then respect for each other, even at a leadership position, will also disintegrate. What we need to reestablish is that respect for the liberation of our people on a grassroots level. What we need to reestablish is an understanding that this liberation movement of ours is not one that belongs to a small elite who are in leadership positions and who, over a couple of years, because of their access to power and to money, have become millionaires and billionaires. The ANC is not a billionaire organization. The ANC cannot be led by the interests of billionaires. The ANC must ultimately be led by the needs and the interests of the poor and the poorest of the poor. And that is what we have to find back. That is what respect must mean within this organization. We have reached a point, unfortunately, where that respect has been eroded away. It has to be regained. And once again, I believe that if the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions can play its true role, it can help us to regain that sense of who the ANC should truly be, and that respect for the people in this country who we must serve, rather than think of the people as our servants. Ultimately, it must be service to the people, not to be served, to be empowered and to be enriched at the cost of the people.
Yep. And then this is the final question we have. It came when you just started answering those ones. It says, I think there was a similar question posed earlier on to this and you had answered it, but I just want to be fair and read out the question as well. So the question is, what avenue are availed by the movement in its current form to deal with counter-revolutionary elements?
I think that is a question that also relates to earlier on when you made the third remark about the struggle. How do we deal with counter-revolutionaries? We deal with counter-revolutionaries through empowerment of the people. Because counter-revolutionaries are always individuals. They are never a full-blown organizational structure. They're individuals in specific positions where they can exert their influence and sometimes are behaving like agents for other forces, both nationally and internationally. So the only way in which counter-revolution can be dealt with is to go back to the grassroots, to mobilize the people. That is how the African National Congress succeeded in fighting the apartheid regime. That has been the underlying foundation of the alliance. The underlying thinking of the alliance has always been mass-based mobilization. We have to return to that. We have to return to a situation where we mobilize at the grassroots level in our branches to bring back the revolutionary heart of the ANC through this pro-poor, agenda and working class commitment. And I want to emphasize this, we have to fight the horrible, insidious, erosive, corrosive power of money. The worst thing that has been happening to our beloved organization, the ANC, has been the role of money in determining the outcome of elections. Whether it's at branch level, at regional level, at provincial level, or national level. We have to fight that money will not determine how a person will vote, but that the real interests of the people will determine how a delegate that goes to a conference will vote. Because you see, comrades, it comes back to the issue of respect again. There are those who have money, who exploit the poverty of our people, the urgent and sometimes desperate needs of our people, because they are so desperately poor, and use money then to divert them from their own best interests by paying them something, because in the short term it helps to alleviate some of the challenges that people are faced at home, that comrades are faced with regards to children, to school fees, to taking care of extended families, parents, etc. But you see, the 5,000 or 10,000 or whatever amount that gets paid for someone to vote for someone, by someone to vote for someone, can never, in a fundamental sense, change the foundation of injustice in our society. So, in the mobilization process, at branch level, at grassroots level, a critical part of that mobilization has to be to take decisive action against the corruptive power of money and the issue of vote buying, whether it's at a national level or at a branch level. That we must not let off the hook in any way whatsoever. Our people should not be bought. Our people should vote on the basis of ideology, not on the basis of rands and cents. Thanks, comrades.
Mandla, thank you, Comrade Carl. It's been an informative one. It's been a worthwhile one. I'm not going to stretch it any longer. Instead, I just want to say thank you for taking time. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And thank you for preparing everything that you've prepared and you've shared with us. It truly has been eye-opening and it truly has been worthwhile. The alliance continues. And it goes back to what you were saying and what Comrade Joslovo, whom you had quoted, had said also. It's important that all of us in the alliance, we know our role in the alliance, and in doing so, we will be unified and the alliance will go forward. Comrade Carl, there's no further questions, so I think we'll wrap it here for tonight. So thank you very much, Comrade Carl. This was the first to what will be a series of Umrabulo Thursdays that we're hoping to have every Thursday. And this was the very first one. So you are our inaugural person into that specific political education Thursday. So we thank you very much for your time. And we thank you for being here with us.
Thank you, comrade. And my congratulations for this initiative that you've taken. And my comradely greetings to all the comrades in your branch, in the Dalla Oma region and throughout our country. Aluta continua.
Mandla.
Amandla.